Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on PCI compliance in the cloud. My name is Kishore Vaswani, and I'm the CEO of ControlCase. Our agenda today will be just a brief introduction to ControlCase. We'll talk a little bit about the cloud. We will spend the majority of the time today on how PCI compliance affects the cloud. After that, we'll talk about the ControlCase's continuous compliance offering in the cloud. And as I mentioned, as we go through the webinar today, please feel free to put any questions in the questions window, and we will answer them in the order that we receive them. A little bit about ControlCase. We focus on IT compliance and IT certifications, as well as related continuous compliance services. We are a global company. And we provide both cloud as well as traditional environment certification and continuous compliance services. The customers that we work with appreciate these two things about us. One is our partnership approach in helping them get compliant and certified, and then the use of automation to help use technology to help the certification process right from kickoff to the final certification. And then finally, here are some of the certifications and attestations that we participate in and are able to help companies get compliant and are certified to these standards. Okay, let's move on to the second section, which is about the cloud. Obviously, we use the word cloud very often now, and certainly is a buzzword for many different things out there. When we talk about PCI DSS and payments, certainly cloud is one of the areas where there's a lot of innovation going on and requires special attention. Just like there are evolving other areas within PCI DSS, such as mobile, as well as point-to-point encryption, that are changing the way payments work and the payments landscape out there. When we talk about the cloud, there are different architectures that can be thought of when we talk about the cloud. You could have a private cloud through a hosting provider, and we have just listed some of the names here, where you are outsourcing your infrastructure to another third party who's in the business of providing hosting services or private cloud services. Then you have things like Amazon, Azure, Google, GCP, which really focus on providing you a private section, but it is a third party without, I call it physical constraints, in the sense a lot of these cloud providers are global cloud providers and really are public clouds. And then finally, there's the internal cloud, which is companies may still have their data centers, but they can still have a cloud-like environment by implementing virtualization within their internal data centers. So all the three types of environments, in some sense, can be referred to as cloud, but they're architected differently and obviously different business models within them. When we talk about compliance in general, there are some key differences that obviously pertain and relate to cloud versus non-cloud. Physical access is a big piece, because in many cases, especially if it's public clouds like Amazon, Azure, or Microsoft Azure and Google, the physical data center and the physical security matters less, because that is being taken care of from the cloud provider. So sometimes the physical boundaries may be known, sometimes unknown. When we talk about physical versus logical access certainly applies, but there's difference in how compliance can be looked at from a virtualization perspective, and where does the boundary lie between the cloud provider and you as a customer. And then depending on whether it's a private or public cloud, again, compliance may differ. So these are some of the vectors because of which compliance may differ based on the type of the cloud environment. So, we talked a little bit about ControlCase. We talked about the different types of clouds and what drives this discussion, which is why compliance in the cloud could be a little different than traditional environments. We're going to focus now on our meat of our presentation today, which is going to be PCI compliance in the cloud. As we go through, again, just feel free to put questions in the questions window. We will be distributing these slides, so you can take notes, but you'd also be getting a set of these slides. For those of you who are new, what is PCI DSS? PCI DSS is a set of standards out there, and it's the specific standard which basically provides guidelines and a standard for securely processing, storing, or transmitting of payment card data. It's maintained by the PCI Council and is maintained and has been established by leading payment card issuers in the past. When we talk about PCI DSS requirements, they can broadly be based and classified into 6 high-level requirements that go into 12 lower-level requirements. So the first one is around maintaining a secure network, and it looks at things like firewalls and so forth. The second one is around protecting cardholder data, and that really goes in the context of things like encryption of cardholder data in storage, transmission, and so forth. Maintaining a vulnerability management program to ensure things are secure and vulnerabilities are identified. Certainly, access control measures, which focus on ensuring both physical as well as logical security. Then you have regularly monitoring and testing networks, which is an important aspect of it. And finally, maintaining an information security program that addresses information security in general and payment card security in particular. So we'll go through the requirements one by one. So we'll go through the 12 sub-requirements that I showed earlier. And what we wanted to do is make sure we can provide you a tactical checklist you can use to compare that requirement for PCI based on you using a cloud versus hosting in-house. And again, we'll be distributing these slides, so you'll have this list. When we talk about firewalls, which is requirement 1, typically, you as the customer must ensure that the DMZ has been implemented consistent with the PCI requirements. In the cloud provider space, you had to make sure that secure configurations and appropriate access is the main vector on how firewalls and access controls happen between the different networks in a cloud environment, because a lot of times physical firewalls are not possible to be implemented there. When we talk about configuration standards, again, typically in the general environment, you as the customer has to ensure that security configurations exist within the cloud images of the operating systems. So while the cloud provider must provide secure configurations for the base platform, so hypervisors and so forth is the responsibility of the cloud provider, you as the customer are still responsible for making sure secure configuration exists for the operating systems that you are responsible for hosting in that cloud. And so that's how you have to make sure that there are responsibilities for the cloud provider and you as the customer. When we talk about protecting stored cardholder data or encrypting cardholder data, the cloud provider really has no role to play because typically customers themselves maintain cardholder data and have to protect cardholder data within databases, file systems, and so forth to the extent they are stored. And so this is really, all of you must ensure data is encrypted and protected. The cloud has very little role to play in encryption of stored card data. The same thing at the application level, Protecting cardholder data in transmission, you have to ensure that you're using secure transmission standards, strong TLS, HTTPS, and so forth when card data is being transmitted. When we talk about anti-malware and antivirus, the cloud provider has to ensure that appropriate anti-malware measures are there for the base platform or the hypervisors. And you as the customer obviously had to make sure that all the cloud images of the operating systems have anti-malware measures. So as you can see, the theme that's going on is at the hypervisor level, the cloud provider has to provide a lot of the security measures, and you as the customer have to look at your application and your operating systems to the extent they exist. Obviously, today there are even serverless platforms in the cloud, which make it even more interesting, and you could almost add another layer to that. Secure applications. Typically, the security at the application layer is the responsibility of the company hosting in the cloud. The cloud providers typically do not get into actually coding applications or making sure they have anything to do with securing applications at the application layer. Next one is access controls and user IDs. So the cloud providers have to ensure that the right segregation of duties exist so that people with access to the base platform or the hypervisors is appropriate. Obviously, those base hypervisors control a lot of different customers. And so it is paramount that the cloud provider provide access control measures to the base platform and the hypervisor. You as the customer are responsible for ensuring that the operating systems and the assets that are being managed by you on top of the cloud provider are appropriate. So the requirement 7 and 8 looked at logical access control. Requirement number 9 looks at physical security. Typically, in this case, you just have to make sure that the cloud provider's compliance program ensures that they're looking at physical security. But most of the responsibility, or if not all of the responsibility of physical security, lies with the cloud provider in this case. So this is one of the requirements where a lot of the responsibility for physical security lies with the cloud provider, and you must just ensure that they have the right security controls in place. For requirement number 10, for the cloud provider, they need to ensure that the cloud does logging and monitoring of the base hypervisors, just like we have talked in the past. But also, because the cloud provider is bearing most of the infrastructure of network and security devices, they must ensure that logging is appropriately implemented for network and security devices within the environment. You as the customer obviously had to make sure that your applications, your operating systems, and the assets that are sitting on top of that cloud are appropriately doing logging and monitoring, or they're doing logging and you're making sure that monitoring is happening properly on an ongoing basis. From a vulnerability management perspective, the cloud providers have to have their vulnerability management program to scan the common assets that span across customers, make sure they're scanning network and security devices, base platforms, hypervisors, and so forth. You as the customer who is hosting in a cloud is responsible for doing the internal, external, and application vulnerability assessment, fixing any issues that come up, and then going back and retesting to ensure you're compliant. And finally, from a requirements 12 perspective, which is policies and procedures, the cloud providers have to ensure that they have their policies and procedures, and their policies and procedures should clearly outline what are their responsibilities versus what are the responsibilities of you as the customer. In fact, most of the cloud providers need to maintain a responsibility matrix in which they identify what are the areas that is the responsibility of the customer, and what is the area which is the responsibility of the cloud provider. So, we went through different requirements here, requirement 1 through requirement 12. If I had to summarize, certainly the security of the hypervisors, logging, monitoring, and so forth is clearly the responsibility of the cloud provider. User access and other controls on the operating systems being hosted on the cloud is typically the responsibility of the customer that's being hosted in the cloud. The application layer controls, such as application security, encryption, and so forth, are certainly always the responsibility of only the customer who's hosting in the cloud. And then policies and procedures and so forth are shared between the cloud provider and their customers hosting in the cloud. So you will have that checklist to make sure you have the cloud responsibilities as well as your responsibilities as a customer of the cloud. Here are some key takeaways as you make decisions in the cloud, or if you're already in the cloud, how you evaluate your security. The first and the most important thing is to ensure that your cloud provider is PCI DSS certified. And when we talk about them being PCI DSS certified, we're not talking about them taking credit cards to provide their service as a merchant. We're really talking about your cloud provider having PCI compliance as a service provider within the infrastructure. So they need to be certified as a service provider, providing infrastructure to their customers for hosting. So certainly make sure that that is true if you're moving to the cloud or are already in the cloud. And then I talked earlier about the service provider compliance matrix. And so you want to make sure that except requirement number 3, 4, and 6, all the other requirements, your hosting provider or the cloud has clearly identified how they're meeting their side of the requirements. How are they ensuring that the hypervisors and all the other things we talked about, that is the responsibility of the cloud provider, is in fact being met. So making sure that the service provider or the cloud provider matrix has all the requirements covered except requirement 3, 4, 6, which is typically the responsibility of the customers that are hosting in the cloud, should be covered by your cloud provider. And so again, these are some very high level areas that you can look at and either verify or re-verify as you either go to the cloud or evaluate your compliance once you're hosted in the cloud. So we talked, as we get towards the end of this presentation, certainly put any questions in the questions window, and we will answer them, in the order you did put your questions in. The last section is about control cases, continuous compliance in the cloud. Our services in the cloud include reviewing 20 to 25 high impact data points on a quarterly basis using a combination of both technical tools as well as some manual interviewing. The benefits of continuous compliance is that it eliminates the need for potential last-minute audit findings. It reduces the cost and the effort eventually, and then it reduces the risk of technical shortcomings, which are very common in the compliance space, such as logs not reporting, quarterly scans missed, and so forth. For our customers, we deploy a fairly robust set of technology, which spans across automated evidence collection, ensuring we are able to do and identify vulnerabilities, and ensuring that the right logs are being delivered by the customer so that they are identified on an ongoing basis and not just towards the end, towards the end of the year when the audit comes up. Again, as we get into the questions, key for ControlCase is to ensure we provide a partnership approach, provide continuous compliance services, and ensure we use technology to make your journey in the cloud and a journey of compliance in the cloud a streamlined process. that was a very high level about PCI compliance in the cloud. As we send these slides, you'll have the list of items you can look at from a PCI compliance perspective. At this point, we will go ahead and answer the questions that were put in the questions window. The first question is, these are the compliance requirements for infrastructure as a service. What about software as a service and platform as a service? That's a great question. When we talk about platform and software, when we talk about software as a service, everything I talked about really applies from a perspective of a customer using a software. In the case of software as a service, the number of requirements that your cloud provider is responsible for are actually much higher than what I showed here. So in software as a service, the application layer controls and the application layer security and encryption may also fall on your service provider. What does remain the same in the example I use, and also in the example of software as a service as well as platform as a service, is that number one, when we talk about the cloud, sometimes the lines are blurred between what's software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, and so forth. What is extremely important is that your provider of as a service provides you the compliance matrix, which shows clearly which items they are looking at and the fact that they are compliant to that. Because that's important on one side. Equally important is that they tell you as a consumer of the cloud that what are the areas of compliance that you need to take care of as part of your certification. So the responsibility matrix really would tell the difference between whether the cloud provider responsibilities as well as your responsibilities. And certainly, what we talked about is really focused on infrastructure as a service compliance. But as you move more and more towards software as a service, the cloud responsibility, the cloud provider's responsibility even gets more and more, and which can be demonstrated typically through their compliance matrix. But a great question. The next question is, does a private cloud also need to be compliant to PCI DSS? And that answer is yes. When we talk about a private cloud, if it certainly needs to be compliant. Now, whether they need to be standalone certified or whether they need to be certified as part of the company's PCI certification, that's a different question, and that can be done many different ways. But certainly when we are talking about payment card data, the compliance to those standards is extremely important. The next question I have is, PCI, what about other compliance requirements like HIPAA and SOC 2 in the cloud? And so a lot of the requirements around most of the compliance regimes out there really fit along similar lines. So a lot of the things I talked about today from a PCI perspective, when you look at HIPAA compliance, you can probably apply the exact same framework and framework for cloud security and compliance, except replace credit card data with healthcare data for HIPAA as an example. So a lot of the things do apply in the same manner, but then certain things don't apply or are additional in some of the other regulations. For example, HIPAA does look at privacy, and transaction code sets. PCI obviously looks at confidentiality of data. So it is extremely important to ensure that that when you're looking at a regulation, you're not only looking at confidentiality, but there might be other vectors in HIPAA and so forth, such as privacy, that also make a difference over there. The final question I have, unless someone else adds any other question, is around physical security again on compliance, and the question is, how can you do physical security walkthroughs in cloud environments? And There is a couple of answers to that. If it's a public cloud like AWS or Google or Microsoft Azure, then physical security visits would not be needed, and they would typically be covered in the certification documents of the public cloud. However, if you're using a hosted provider who may not have physical security of your specific section of the data center, certainly then physical security visits within your section of the data center may be needed, to the extent it's not clear that all of it was covered by a private cloud provider. Well, that was the last question I had. I thank you for your time today on attending this webinar. We'll be sending a copy of the slides as well as a recording, and have a great rest of the day. Please feel free to register for additional webinars at www.controlcase.com. Thank you and have a nice day.